Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump talked on the phone today regarding a potential ceasefire in Ukraine. Trump described it as a very good one, though not a perfect phone call. It does, however, finally give me the opportunity to use all of these stock images that I've been saving up over the years. And there are a lot of interesting strategic considerations to cover today. In terms of substantive results coming from the phone call, and what you will be seeing here in a moment is the Kremlin's website's descriptions, translated through Google, so bear in mind some nuance may be lost. There are a few things to note. First, Trump proposed, and Putin accepted, a 30-day ceasefire on energy and infrastructure targets. In practice, assuming they follow through on it, that means relief to Ukraine's energy grid and Russia's oil refineries. But note, that is the extent of the ceasefire for now, as we will talk about in greater depth later. There will also be a prisoner exchange tomorrow, though 175 people from each side is a relatively small number. Then there was a broader discussion about areas of cooperation between Russia and the United States, though those are a bunch of words from the Kremlin's readout without much substance. Switching briefly to the White House's readout, there were discussions of topics related to Israel, Iran, and weapons of mass destruction. Again, though, none of them amounted to much substantively. And finally, get ready for some international hockey between the NHL and the Continental Hockey League, though remember that the NHL is headquartered in Canada. Anyway, the real conversation, and why there continues to be no true ceasefire, is due to the Kremlin's proposed restrictions on Ukraine's military during a ceasefire. Namely, the Kremlin demands an end to Ukrainian conscription, no rearmament, and perhaps the thing that will prove most problematic of all, a cessation of foreign military aid and intelligence assistance to Kyiv. In that light, today, let's cover 4 things. First, I want to put this in the broader context of the war recently and ceasefires historically. Second, we will examine the follow-on effects of armament restrictions, which are actually quite complicated and to some degree may benefit a party under a restriction. Third, we will have a short section on the enforceability of rearmament limits. And finally, we will explore whether Russia is in any position to make such demands, given the broader context of the US ceasefire plan. But first, the broader context of rearmament limitations. Much of the reaction that I saw to Russia's demand was shock that Ukraine would be asked to do anything of the sort. To me, this was puzzling for 2 reasons. First, should it really be surprising that Russia was asking for something that makes Russia better off? The Kremlin's prevailing narrative of the war for more than a year now is that Russia is confident about what will happen on the battlefield. And while we might debate on how to interpret Russia's recent advances on the battlefield, making such demands at the negotiating table is just par for the Kremlin's course. Maybe in preparation for the NHL-KHL battle, we should just recognize a Russian power play when we see one, and move on with our lives. Obviously, Russia is better off when Ukraine has fewer weapons to defend itself. Why wouldn't the Kremlin want to put itself in a better position? At the same time, though, the White House is well aware of the implications of Ukraine trying to sustain a peace from a position of weakness. That is why continued armament was a part of Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg's white paper that started this whole process. The second half of this is that arms limitations are omnipresent in ceasefire agreements, so much so that it would be shocking if ultimately there is not one here. Just think about all of the regulations surrounding the Korean demilitarized zone, which is likely the closest parallel that we will have to a ceasefire today. In fact, it is the 38th parallel, or close enough. Anyway, the reason being is that for a party to want to agree to a ceasefire, the balance of power in the long run cannot drift too far away from the balance of power at the time of signature. Rearmament provisions are what attempt to regulate that. Thus, the conversation that the West should be having is not whether there will be arms restrictions, but rather the extent to which there will be arms restrictions. Because there is a massive difference between Ukraine being unable to produce or receive a single bullet, and Europe emptying all of its warehouses to send to Ukraine. And that does not begin to cover the restrictions that Russia might agree to. It turns out that you cannot always be on the power play. Sometimes the other team is going to force you to skate at even strength. To provide a blunt conclusion to this section, these demands are a non-starter. Remember that the motivation that the Trump administration gave to Ukraine to enter ceasefire negotiations is the loss of aid otherwise. Well, if the ceasefire is going to result in the end of assistance from everyone, including Europe, then there is not much reason to remain on board with the process from Kyiv's perspective. However, if we want to think about this as the Kremlin's opening position on ceasefire negotiations, we need to learn a bit more about the second-order consequences of arms restrictions. I mentioned in the last video that there is an entire literature on the benefits of limiting one's future power. Well, here, I want to convey the theory behind power shifts and preventive war at a high level, with some interpretation of how it may apply to the situation at hand. As background, remember that perhaps the main reason that Russia wants to delay a ceasefire is because of the momentum it has along the Eastern Front, and especially for the moment, in Kursk. If the war pauses, then Ukraine can start digging trenches, and thus what continued war right now would produce for Russia exceeds what Russia would expect if it restarted a war later. If the expected shift is too much, then the cost savings of a ceasefire are insufficient to induce Russia to accept one. This is a common topic of conversation within the war analysis community, but what does not get discussed enough is how this is bad from Ukraine's perspective, at least insofar as the bilateral war is concerned. Don't worry, I promise that we will bring Europe and the United States back into the picture by the end of the video. But for now, remember that war is continuing under circumstances where Ukraine lacks the proper fortifications to stop Russia. It is therefore advantageous to Kyiv for the war to pause, so long as it can make use of that time. Let's diagram the problem from Ukraine's perspective, subject to the Kremlin's ability to interfere. On the horizontal axis, we have Ukraine's military power in the future relative to Russia, should there be a ceasefire. All the way on the left, Ukraine's strength remains identical to the status quo. All the way on the right, Ukraine somehow becomes omnipotent. On the vertical axis, we have Ukraine's welfare. Higher is better for Kyiv. As Ukraine expects to grow in power, at first there may be no increase to its welfare. This is always confusing the first time that you see it, but the basic idea is that Ukraine will get a better outcome in the future, and so Russia can leverage that against Ukraine regarding negotiations in the present. However, if Ukraine's expected future power is large enough, Russia cannot extract any more from Ukraine in the present, and intuitively Ukraine's welfare begins to increase. But that does not last forever. At some point, it drops off and stays at the baseline level, as if Ukraine will not grow more powerful over time. And indeed, that is more or less what is happening. What determines the location of this breakpoint is where Russia calculates that the post-ceasefire outcome would give Ukraine too much of an advantage, and so Russia stops it from ever getting to that point by continuing to fight the war right now. Consequently, the game, as it were, for Ukraine is to structure a ceasefire in a manner that gets as close as possible to this point without exceeding it, which would thereby cause its welfare to fall off of a cliff. In other words, some type of restrictions may be helpful for Ukraine because they are necessary for a ceasefire to begin, and the ceasefire will help Ukraine fortify its existing defensive lines. With that said, a couple of key points about this figure. First, I would not take any of those words from the Kremlin's earlier readout as indicative of any particular demand being necessary to obtain the peace. What this graph did not originally show us is that Russia's welfare only gets better going to the left, and so there is a clear incentive for the Kremlin to claim that the world looks like this and thus it is in everyone's best interest to commit to some level of restrictions, when in fact the world looks like this, and Russia would have accepted a more powerful Ukraine in the future. Put differently, the cautious warning about listening to what leaders say remains in effect. Second, Russia will be rearming during this time as well. And remember, this axis reflects the relative balance of power between the two of them, and also misleadingly suggests that Ukraine could not get any weaker over time. However, if there are no enforceable restrictions on Russian armament, then Ukraine may be able to take drastic steps while still getting a ceasefire in place. Two more shorter points to finish off. I just mentioned enforceable restrictions, so let's cover that first. In theory, the way that you enforce arms restrictions is through the threat to revert back to war if one side breaks the agreement. However, that presupposes the ability to monitor violations of the rules, which, unlike making a Christmas call, can be very difficult to do in practice depending on the means of armament. In fact, I would say the difficulty level is more like being a Steelers fan in an era of mediocrity. Well, the standard is the standard for a ceasefire deal. But something like monitoring intelligence sharing is next to impossible. None of that is physically moving across international borders or being deployed to the front line. Moreover, any NATO country could flick a switch one day, and then suddenly all of that intelligence immediately returns to Ukraine. Enforceability problems run both ways. The Kremlin knows this, and the Kremlin knows as well that prohibiting intelligence sharing is unenforceable. Thus, it is curious to include it as a demand at all, except for maybe my next point. There is also the meta problem of authenticating claims of violations. Imagine that Russia agrees to a 30-day ceasefire, but would prefer to continue the war. Then, voila, claim that there was a violation of the rules and get back to fighting as you wished. Given the difficulty of observing violations, those paying close attention to the war are likely not going to be persuaded by those claims. But to the casual observer, that is a different story. And that provides the perfect transition to our last topic, whether Russia is in the position to make any demands at all like this. Given Russia's tempo advantage, stalling the implementation of a forced ceasefire is advantageous to the Kremlin. Thus, one way to interpret Russia's demands is that this is just a way to slow down the process without appearing to be unreasonable, again, at least in the eyes of a casual observer. But if what Trump has in mind is an unconditional ceasefire, well, those are a bunch of conditions that Russia has just layered on. And that leaves open the question of whether the Trump administration is willing to see where this goes, or if the United States will begin ramping up armaments to Ukraine. Remember, the United States is supposed to play kingmaker here, by either denying Ukraine aid if Ukraine holds out, or spiking aid to Ukraine if Russia holds out. And that additional sway in the balance of power could, in theory, swamp any considerations that Russia may have about tempo and Ukrainian entrenchments. We have a pretty good idea from the Oval Office meltdown that the Trump administration does not think that Ukraine is holding any cards. The question remains how the administration views the distribution of cards between the United States and Russia. Because if everything is in American hands, then the Kremlin should not be able to dictate that part of a ceasefire. Once again, the Kremlin's demands are trying to put Ukraine's situation on par with what would happen if Ukraine refused to participate in the Trump plan at all, and if suddenly every NATO country abandoned Ukraine. That is very far away from what the Trump administration has articulated over the last month, and thus it seems that the Kremlin is trying to take over the lead role in dictating the terms of a settlement. Will that work? Well, it seems like the ball is back in Washington's court. We will wait to see what Trump's next move is, or, perhaps more descriptively, what Trump card Trump might play. Because, right now, Russia seems to be calling the president's bluff. And given the lack of armaments sent to Ukraine ahead of time to signal Trump's sincerity, maybe that should not be so surprising. Meanwhile, I have dictated that every video must end with these two wonderful books about the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.